Welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for your patience today. We're having a few technical difficulties here in Zoom land, but we sorted it out and really happy you're here to join us for our second event in our second season of the Artist as Storyteller Speaker Series. My name is Paul Kikuchi. I'm music faculty at South Seattle College, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderators for today's conversation with Seattle-based poet Arianne True. Before I introduce Amiko, Nicole, and Arianne, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement to set our intention and energy before we become immersed in our conversation. So we would like to acknowledge that the Artist as Storyteller project is located in West Seattle, the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Members of our team were born and raised on the traditional lands of the Suquamish, Sklallam, Chumash, Tongva, Shawnee, and Kickapoo tribes, and we would like to honor the stewardship of these indigenous peoples whose land and stories we now have the privilege of having been shaped by. So thank you. A bit about the Artist as Storyteller series for those of you who are here with us for the first time. So the Artist as Storyteller speaker series was fueled by the desire to put BIPOC artists, performers, activists directly into conversation with students and with the community to create a new space for human connection and also celebrate creativity in all of its forms. And our theme for our second season is return. So I would like to first welcome Nicole Onopa. Nicole is our student moderator today. Nicole is a lifelong student of psychology. Her passions are helping those in need, painting with watercolors, and spending time with her partner and her dog Zen. Nicole just shared with us, hope I can share, Nicole, that she's going to be attending Antioch College for further studies in psychology. So congratulations, Nicole. That's super exciting.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And our faculty moderator today is Amiko Matsuo. Amiko is an artist and educator whose work focuses on transmigration, cultural exchange, and translation. Her past installations explore place, identity, and materiality in the fire-prone landscapes using ceramics, ash, and Phosgene flame retardant. She's currently working with descendant Hibaku survivor trees from the 1945 bombing of Hiroshima to recall the threat of mass destruction and the hope for ecological resilience. What's up, Amiko? So nice to have you here.
So happy to be here.
And so now I'm really happy to introduce our featured wonderful guest artist, Arianne True. Arianne True, Choctaw and Chickasaw, is a queer poet and folk artist from Seattle. She teaches and mentors with Writers in the Schools, the Seattle Youth Poet Laureate program, and the Young Writers Cohort. Arianne has received fellowships from Jack Straw and the Hugo House and is a proud alum of Hedgebrook and the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She is currently the Seattle Rep 2021-2022 Native Artist in Residence. Welcome, Arianne. So awesome to have you here. I'm psyched to have you in conversation and in community with us today.
Thanks, me too. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Right on. So I think at this point, I am going to hide my face and turn this conversation over to Nicole, Amiko, and Arianne. And thank you all in the audience for being here. I will say lastly that there will be a Q&A portion at the end of our event today. So if you are joining us in the audience today and you have questions, feel free to just type those in to the chat, and we will hopefully be able to get to all questions and or comments that are submitted today. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Arianne, I just wanted to share with you that my students are currently engaging in a poetry activity based on your poems. And I was hoping that we can start out our conversation today by having you share a few of your pieces. So please take it away for, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I was so excited to hear that y'all are working with the mini series for the two pandemic pieces. So I thought I would read those first. And I figured I would share 4 poems with y'all and we could chat about them a little bit in between if that sounds fun. Cool. Okay. So I'm just going to be reading this first one. If you want to close your eyes, you can, whatever feels good to you. I'll put later ones up on the screen, but this one I think will just be audio. Pandemic. While home is an outbreak, we pass a graveyard. This country has a way of forgetting the dead, of making me forget too. I read about other places where dead are visited and headstones washed, places where altars bring them home to us once a year or always. Growing up, I heard not to breathe passing graveyards, or what, no one ever said. I've only stopped doing it this year. I don't know where my 3 gone grandparents are, not their remains. The 4th wants to be ash on the ocean. I have never been to the grave of someone I knew, and we have no place in our homes for our dead. They find places to come anyway, out and around, Chloe chuckling at me on a bus over the university bridge, Kim on by my desk or driving out of town, Amy, Mark and Ed, Nadine. We have no idea what to do with the bodies. They end up chemical in corners by the highway with the soft feet of caretakers, the held breath of passing children. It is most of a forgetting. We left the dead behind to come here. My people too. A decade on foot, guns and graves at our backs, graves at our feet. Who visits them? I haven't yet. And the tall northern villagers who came on steamships. The bodies, flowers, songs, now an ocean away. My dead lie trailside and across the salt ocean, becoming lands I have never walked, don't have the right names for. Hope to tread, and will tread with reverence. Will breathe when I pass, and will pause. Will trust the hands I feel at my back, dozens, almost solid where they make contact. Of course, we have broken how to be with death when the old earth of their bodies is too far to fall to. Nowhere to kneel and keen. Sometimes no names to call, or the wrong words to call them in. Losses we can't name in the language they happened. Today, I am scared for names I know, loss I'm afraid to become fluent in. Under which tender bodies, whose poems I have pressed to my lips, graves may open. But this week, after months of blue fingertips, there is just enough warmth in the damp spring to leave the window open a breath at night and wake up every morning, when we do wake up, to birdsong. I wanted to share that one with you, partly because Amiko said y'all are working with it, and partly it's become one of my favorite poems that I've written. It's also my mom's favorite of my poems, which makes it very special to me. But that was a poem that I wrote in March of 2020. So I was the poet in residence at Seattle Youth Books in March. And so the first half of the month was like, poems I'd had ready and saved and was like publishing. And then like halfway through my residency there, the pandemic kind of hit Seattle pretty hard and schools closed and everything. And I got to write that poem and then have it published the next day as my like last piece for that, which felt really special. Usually you don't get to publish poems right away. Usually you have to wait months or years. But it felt really special because that was a poem that I wrote partly to like deal with what I was sitting with, and partly because I saw everyone around me really struggling and could feel that some of that was because they like didn't, like we don't practice. We have no practice with death. There was no culture around death in the US aside from don't talk about it and hide it. But like most of the rest of the world is pretty okay and has traditions and ways that make this something that we can integrate into our living existence. And like we all have roots in those traditions somewhere at some point. So I wanted to make a poem that helped me and would also like help the people around me, which is not usually why I write poems, but it was for that one. And so it was really cool to get that one out there and have folks like, I got a lot of feedback from friends, and like it was the poem that my friends shared more than anything else I've ever written because they were like, this is helping me right now. So that was really cool. That poem is like so dear to me.
That's so awesome, and it spoke to me as well. And I watched some of your stuff before this, and that was one that really stuck out to me. I really do like how you say, all of our ancestry is rooted in one of these traditions. And so, did you want to talk a little about your native roots and how you grew up with that?
Sure, yeah. My mom raised us very native, but then in a different kind of very native story, my mother lost custody to us because of the usual state and gender violence, not through anything that had to do with her, just the same old stuff playing out over and over again. And that's what my second book project that I'm starting to work on is dealing with, is that recursive nature of history, and how we get cut off from those things. So as much as when I was young, this was a huge part of how I was raised, and I've gotten to come back to that, there was a huge number of years in the middle of my life so far where I was very actively cut off from that and very intentionally cut off from that. And there's a very sad way in which that is often part of the Native experience. But yeah, I mean, we have stories, we have traditions, we have very particular stuff around death, particularly around murder. For the Choctaw, if you kill someone else, it's understood that what happens to your life is now the decision of that person's family, because you kind of gave up your right to your life when you decided to take someone else's. And
Wow, that's really interesting.
and that's such a different way to relate to life and death. And there's a whole process around that that's more complicated, but we obviously don't do that anymore. It's super illegal, but
Thank
you. But I also don't know what a lot of the things were. It's hard to get good records because most of the records that are written are from white anthropologists, and so can't be trusted because they had no cultural context. And most of the oral records have been so thoroughly suppressed. So it's that's also part of what I'm trying to reckon with in that poem, is I don't have access to the things that I need, even though I know they existed and probably still do, but they're very hard to find.
Oh, wow, absolutely. That's a lot, yeah.
Do you want the next one?
Yeah, maybe we can have you share the next one, and I'd love to hear the next one. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this is the other pandemic one. This one's little. And I'll just read this one out loud again. Pandemic. Even the nice days were inside. The forest drifts in through the window, rising up the slope from narrow water, carving low points lower. Once with you, a waiting bird we watched, waiting to see how close it would come. Now that trail is gated by the threat of breath. Too many people too close, path sated and spilling over. I am hungry for the touch of ferns, for happenstance, and a lost world of coincidence I once felt standing all around me, like a stand of trees in the city. And that was another one that I think was March or April of 2020, and has been really comforting to me. It's really nice. I think that's one of the cool things about being an artist, is you can make things that are good for you. And that poem has been a continual cold comfort for me for the last year and a half, because it's so short. I know it pretty much in my head, and sometimes it just comes up and I'm oh yeah, that's the feeling. Okay, I can soothe myself a little from that. I feel this poem, Amiko told me that y'all have been working with ghost stuff around this, and I feel these poems, these two, are very much together, but I feel they deal with ghosts really differently. And for me, the ghosts in this one are the ghosts of feelings or of circumstances, rather than the ghosts of peoples and traditions. But how you can sometimes know that there were feelings or things you used to experience that you don't have right now. And like, I think you can feel those ghosts sometimes. Q&A, what was the title of the first poem? I'm gonna type it because then it's on the record. It's called Pandemic When Home is an Outbreak. We Pass a Graveyard. And that one is published online. You can see that one. Do you want to talk more about those two poems for now, or do you want me to go into the other?
Maybe we can, if that's all right with you. I'm breaking form. And I'm just going to jump in and say, like, there was something that felt so immediate about those two poems. And those are the ones that, as I was reading through your work, those are the ones that that helped me through this period as well. And I'm wondering if I can ask you a little bit about how does a poem like this, how do you compose a poem like this, right? So for me, like not having access to the studio during that time, like there was something about your poems that just cut straight through all of that stuff process. And then like, I felt it in my body, especially as you talk about breath. I'm like, yeah, just remembering that again. So a little bit about how you compose a poem like this, and then like, does it come all at once? Do you revise? Do you tinker?
Yeah, I love that you're specifically asking about these, because like I was thinking about the question earlier of like poetic process, and I was like, it's different for everyone, or like, for groups of them. So for the first one, the long one, that one came out of my partner needed us, like, she works from home because she's like an entrepreneur, self-employed person. And so as soon as we were like, everything is shutting down, we were like, we have to get her a standing desk because she's not gonna be able to go to her co-working space and she's not gonna be traveling for gigs for a while. And so we ended up on this road trip to Shelton, Washington. And they were just like, in that, like, so many things along that road trip, just like Pam Houston talks about glimmers, like these just little pieces of things where as you like experience them or think about them, you're like, that's a thing. I'm gonna put that in my pocket. And so like I have like a note on my phone and a physical notebook I carry where I put those glimmers down. And so there were a ton of glimmers from that trip, including the specifics of passing this like little highway off-ramp graveyard and just being like, oh man, this is so upsetting that there's this like graveyard. This is like a sacred holy space and it's tucked into a freeway off-ramp. Like that felt so sacrilegious and like woof to me. And so it kind of started out of that. And then I had all this pile of glimmers and this like rare desire to do something specific around other people. And I spent all of a Friday just like working on that poem in my room, not talking to anyone, putting it together, and trying to figure out like what felt most like real and true to me, but also like the plainest way to say it. That felt important. I was like, I want this to be very accessible. I don't want people to have to try to understand what's going on. Like, what's going on is plenty. So that was how that one came around, which is not what I always do, but for a couple poems, I've done that. And the second one came out of, so the Writers in the Schools program, we have like, it's a beautiful cohort of writing teachers. I love everyone there to the moon and back. They're like my favorite people. And at all of our meetings, which we started having every week during the first few months of the pandemic, one of the writers, I think it might have been Ann Teplick, gave us this prompt around, it was a structural prompt around making what's called, I think, a ladder poem, where you start by just you pick a word, and then for like 10 lines, you just write a word that you associate with that word before it. So it could be sound, it could be meaning, and you create that, and then that's the center of your poem, and you write a poem around it. And I find that like, I really love structure in poems, and I like things like that. It helps me, like, then you don't have to focus on how you're doing something as much. It can kind of, yeah, those kind of constraints I find really help me get to where I actually want to go. If that makes sense. I'm a big fan of creative constraint.
So that kind of makes me wonder then, when you write, are you trying to like paint an image with your words, or do you intentionally leave room for the reader's imagination, or is it something else?
It depends. There are times when I go like hard image. Like there's like a 5-minute long poem I have that is just solid image. And I love it. It's very fun. And like the point of that was like, I want to create this scene so vividly for people that they can't not see and feel it when they read this. But sometimes it's less about image and more about like, I don't know. I'm not always sure how to talk about like some of the poems in the exhibits project, because they're not really working with image. They're not really working with sound. They're kind of working with like multiple voices and how those interact with each other.
I'm humming and listening actively. I'm just not like putting it all out there, but yeah, that sounds really interesting. What was the poem that you said was Hard Image? What was the title of that?
That one is called, oh no, I changed the title. I don't remember the new one. It used to be called Winter Storm, but it has a good, oh wait, no, it's called The Gravity of Joy. That's the title. That one's not published yet.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you.
It's a newer one. That one's from earlier this year. Yeah, sometimes the titles change and I forget what they are.
I totally understand that.
Yeah, so that answers my question about the tinkering. But yeah, let's shall we try another poem and then we'll continue to yeah.
So this actually segues really nicely because I just mentioned exhibits, which are the like kind of multivocal, like what's happening here poems. So I will share this one on the screen because it is important that you see it. This is what I have. So that residency at the Seattle Rep, this is the book that I'm finishing as part of that. And then in the first week, early April, we're putting together, I guess mostly me, are putting together an exhibition installation kind of thing that'll be open to the public of like the whole book turned into a gallery installation that you can walk around in. So if you think this next one is fun, mark your calendars for early April at the Rep. And if you don't think it's fun, that's really normal. Okay, so I'm always curious. No, when I have like a bunch of students that I can talk back and forth with, I always want to know how people want to read these or what they think they might be read as. Because we don't have that set up, I think I might just go ahead and read it. Consumption, your favorite myth, to hit the fact that I choke on my food again. Unlike stories, ing tool, old and durable, remains. Some of my friends have asked, does native mean you? Have you noticed, embodied by, compliant in schools, we, knowing, braided, fragmented, soft. Not everything needs to be about myths. Elaborate entrails, writing breaks the work of rendering you a couple years ago without dialogue, troubling, lost, in my own work, Indian enough. Some of my friends have asked, not everything needs to be consumption. Does native mean you, your favorite myth about myths? Not elaborate entrails to hit the fact that writing breaks the work of rendering deeply. I choke on my food, you. Have you noticed a couple of years again without dialogue, unlike stories embodied by troubling compliant ing tool in schools, lost, we, old and durable knowing, remains braided, fragmented, in my own work, soft, Indian enough. Silence.
Wow, I've seen that one. I would have no idea that that is how you intended it to be read. That's awesome.
I mean, that's part of the joy of writing weird stuff is like, there's ways that I read it, but those are like, I don't think there are ways I intend for it to be read or not read. For me, like part of the point of this project and why I like that it's a printed project is because you have to choose. I'm really interested in like, so there's this author, Mark Danielewski, who's known for his book House of Leaves. That was his like big breakout, which was published like originally on the internet and became like a weird internet cult book, but is now like traditionally published. And I was really into it starting in high school. And he talked about, in an interview I can't find anymore, about how like he doesn't think that reading should be easy. Like he doesn't think you should just be able to receive the words and that's the whole experience. He thinks the reader should be an active participant in the act of reading. And I don't want that to be true for everything, like I talked about earlier. Like it was really important to me that that first poem was extremely accessible because it's dealing with stuff that like is plenty to deal with on its own. But like for this project, that's really what I'm interested in, is like what the reader can do as an active participant, how the reader makes choices, what you choose to see and how, because that's a lot of what the book overall is working with. Because it's looking at these stories, like stories of like child abuse and things like that, that like people don't look at and very intentionally do not look at, even though it's so common, and not looking makes it so much more dangerous. And so like that's part of the point of these, is like you have choice, you're choosing what you want to see. And I love that I can make the reader complicit in that. It makes me so happy.
That is so very awesome. I love it.
Yeah, and yet it's still framed, and what I read is like annotations are there too. And so yeah, the frame is almost like a window too, now that I'm looking at it. So there's something like really visual about your work as well. I'm wondering if I can, you know, Nicole and I, when we were discussing your poems, we were talking a little bit about your work and how it moves from two-dimensionality to three-dimensionality, or we just talked about it in terms of it like crossing over multiple dimensions. And then I'm also thinking about, yeah, like as I mentioned before, as a reader, I have noticed that I become more bodily, like somehow I become more aware of my body when I'm reading your work. And I think generally, I think like I just become more spatially aware when I'm reading works of yours. And then like that connects to the whole, what you're saying about installations, how you're creating spaces that we can walk through and experience in different ways, different like conceptual ways, but then also like physically as well. So I'm wondering if this could be a good time to have you elaborate a little bit more on how you're thinking about space.
Yeah, I would love to. I love that question. I love that stuff so much. I think it's one of like the biggest, and I'm leaving this up because I do want to talk about it a little bit too as part of my answer. I think one of the most interesting things for me, aside from all those things we just talked about, is like this question of how can I put an experience into someone else's body? Like, I think that's one of the most magical things that art can do, and like is, I think, a way it tells stories, but like it gets in somehow deeper. And I think the way I do that is poetry right now. But I think there are artists in every genre who do this, and that I just like Google over and like figure out how can I do this in my format, which is why a lot of my stuff is very visual. Like I was a film studies student in college, and I used to do photography. I used to do visual arts. And I also do like ritual mythological theater. So like all of that visual stuff is so cool for me. And I'm always like, how can I take what we have achieved with these like strictly visual things and then move them into what I can do on the page? I do think poetry is essentially a visual language, the same way that film and comics are. And so I'm just wondering, how can I do it my way? But but that question of like, how can I get an experience into someone else's body, I think is one of the greatest magics that we can do. And it's something I'm always trying to figure out. Because, and I think for me, that comes from like, the older I have gotten, the more I have realized how different my experience is to most people, in ways that like, if I tell you now, you're like, of course, but like, it took me a long time to realize that you don't know that everyone else works or thinks or experiences differently than you until you know. Like I didn't realize how different like a Native worldview and upbringing was until I was 20, when some white friends and I were in a Native environment together, and they were like, I've never felt more out of my depth. And I'm like, this is where I feel most at home. And so this like, and that's happened so many ways and so many times, this continual realizing of like, I have fundamentally different experiences than most people. And I think those experiences are important for them to understand. And the easiest way I can do that, or I think the most like visceral way I can do that, is by figuring out how to put that experience into their body so that they have it as part of their like physical somatic understanding. I think it's more powerful than just telling them. And so that's a lot of what I'm often trying, and that's very much what this project is trying to do as well. I left this up to talk about space because these exhibits that are like this, they're meant to be like, they are framed, they're meant to be like pieces in a gallery. The first half of the book is a museum gallery that as the reader, you walk around even within the book. And so this is a gallery piece, and you can see the title is offset down to the side like a placard in a museum. And there's depth of field in this piece. That's what the different types of font and sizes of font are doing. They're creating depth of field on the page. That was something that I kind of came to in combination with a very dear mentor named Ken White, who is a very different kind of poet, but very inspiring to me. So even that, it's still trying to be three-dimensional, just using like the typography stuff. Does that fully answer your question?
Yeah, that's really cool. I wasn't prepared to like talk about this, but for some reason, when I was thinking about your work, I pulled out the Live Form book. This is a book by Jenny Sorkin, and that's where I was reading through it, and then I found MC Richards. And anyway, the point here is that like there's something about these creative, how these artists, poets. MC Richards, the poet, was thinking about the creative act as like having so much transformative potential. And then like, for me, the connection is the word live form, right? Like, so you're talking about form, but there's something that's alive about it. And also it comes to life with all of our experiences that we bring to you as the audience members. And of course, what you've provided, what you've invited us to experience. So I really appreciate what you've just shared with us. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds so cool. I'm gonna like email you for that book info later. I had one more poem I wanted to share that I think is a good transition right now. Should I do that? Okay, cool. I'm gonna show you this one after, but I want you to just hear it first. So I'll read it, then I'll show it to you, and then we'll talk about it. Standby mode. In 10 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically. When she touches me, or I can tell she wants to touch me, in 9 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically. Sometimes I freeze. Even just a kiss, so innocuous, in 8 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically, and I start folding in on myself. Senses go. Those movie scenes, in 7 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically, where it's just a woman's scared face and the sound of trains. In 6 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically, rushing past. The light is always blue and dark and high contrast. In 5 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically. I always come back eventually, though it feels like I never know. In 4 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically. How? Thinking on it now, I couldn't tell you. Thank everything she, in 3 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically, is so patient and not grudgingly. This is the part that feels most. In 2 minutes, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically, like a fight, and like one I have to win. Fight to stay in my body. In 1 minute, power will turn off and go into standby mode automatically. It's hard to tell if I lose just by taking a swing, not, or both. That poem was like a lot to read, both like it is very athletic to read, but it's also just like, whew. I want to show it to you so you can see what it looks like. This is also part of exhibits, scrolling up, and it is working with these frames. And for me, the frames are really important here because it's like a device that people have been introduced to earlier in the book. They already understand a little bit how to work with the frames. Like it's very important to me in experimental works that you scaffold for your readers so they can keep up. And so they understand the frames by now. And the poem is in the frames, but it's broken up by these little standby mode things. Nicole and Amiko, I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your experiences hearing it before I kind of spill my own tea.
You know, I watched, I think, a YouTube video where you had performed this previously, and I want to say you had help with another voice reading, maybe, I'm not sure, or maybe it was the looped.
Is it the Kate Olson video?
I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so hearing you do it, it does sound very athletic. And I'd never seen it on paper. So I'm just having a whirlwind of like information overload, and I really, it's really performative, you know, and that's kind of how I see it. I would not have been able to understand it fully without hearing you read it, seeing it on the paper, and even having that supplemental video.
Yeah, for myself too, for me, I'm seeing connections with another poem that I was gonna ask us to share later. So then I'm gonna hold but anyway, just the idea of disruptions, and yeah, when I close my eyes, it is really interesting. I start to see things. I must be a very visual person.
No, I think that's great. And I mean, that's also like, good. I want that to happen. And I think that's part of exactly what I would hope someone would get from this poem, but like whatever you get from it's great. Like it's, once I've put it out there, it becomes your poem as much as mine because it's your experience with it. But I love that you're talking about like, you can like see these things when you close your eyes, but there's these continual disruptions. So like my kind of idea behind this poem, there's a couple, but like, it goes back to that question of how can I put an experience in someone else's body? I really wanted to like, because like I have a lot of trauma, which means I'm also very familiar with dissociation and like not being able to stay in my body, especially in times when I want to. And I wanted to create a poem that would, as faithfully as I could, recreate that for someone else, especially someone who doesn't understand dissociation, who's never experienced that, who can't even imagine what it's like to not have access to your body in a moment. And so that's what's going on for me here, is there's this experience that is happening through the framed pieces. And then there's this continual and like countdown warning to standby mode, which is often what it feels like for me when I'm dissociated. It's not like a total power shutdown. It's just like we are on reserve power. No screens are on. Nothing can happen. And I love the countdown of it. And like part of why it's so athletic to read is because I do want it to feel very interrupting, which means there's not a lot of places for me to breathe. But yeah, that's a lot of what I wanted to do with this poem, of like, which is kind of weird because it's like, how can I put the experience of not being in your body into someone else's body? Like, it's a fun question. And I really love this piece, even though it's like a difficult piece for me. And with Kate Olson I was a Jack Straw Fellow last year. And with that, we often get to do collaborations with members of the Bushwick Book Club who write songs inspired by literature. And I got to collaborate with Kate Olson, who sometimes is an amazing saxophonist and sometimes is an amazing experimental noise musician. I love her. And so we got to collaborate on, she made a piece using this as a jumping off point of like a live looped noise piece. You can watch that on YouTube, or it's also linked on my website. It's like kind of my dream someday for exhibits to have a companion album that would probably mostly be like weird recordings and noise music.
That's awesome. I highly recommend watching that video. It's very immersive.
Kate did an incredible job. I couldn't have been more happy. It's exactly what I wanted for this piece.
Yeah, I mean, so many things come to mind. Just the fact that you have like different plans for how these pieces can be performed and experienced. I think that's so interesting. But I think like I want to take a moment to ask you a few more questions that might take us in a different direction regarding yeah, regarding the piece about performance, some of us in the audience are educators, and knowing that you're an artist, you're an educator, you're a thinker, you're a performer, I'm wondering if you think about cultivating different versions of who you are within these different spaces. I know that's like a strange, tricky question.
Yeah, I think that's something that was huge for me in high school and was which I was already like writing and performing in high school. Was very important to me that I had these different parts of myself and that they didn't interact. And like over the last 10 plus years since then, it's become more okay for me to let them interact and have access to them. But I think a lot of my work has been kind of the opposite. It's been trying to figure out how I can like let all of my parts exist and have access to them. It's kind of an integrating. I feel like I was in parts and I'm trying to be a whole. That makes sense. I mean, that's the like, that's the therapy answer, but it is also like, that's how it works with a lot of my work too. And that's part of why when I like teach performance to my students, adult or youth, what I talk about is like, I know a lot of people approach performing their creative work, like poems and stories and things like an actor. And I think that's a great method, especially for people who write a lot of character driven things. But like for me, and because of what I'm doing and what I need for myself, I don't approach it like I'm acting. My question is like, how can I fully embody this piece? Like not how can I perform, but how can I become it for the time that it exists out loud? Which is also part of why there are pieces I don't read very often because they are a lot to sit with. There was a series I thought about sharing today and I was like, I can't do that and standby mode in the same hour. Like I don't have the endurance for that. So I'll pick this other one instead that gets at the same ideas. Does that fully answer your question?
I actually have kind of a jumping off from there, wondering, because I'm going into the psychology realm, I understand that there are times when self-disclosure is necessary, and then, that kind of keeping things separate. So how do you navigate, how much to disclose and how much not to?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. And it depends on the space. Like as like a performer and writer, especially as a page writer, but also as a performer, because I got my start in slam. Pretty much everything can go there, but I'll only perform things that I'll only publish or perform things that I'm kind of done with my process with. Where like, if it still feels like a raw nerve, I'm like, that's not ready for other people. If I can't talk about it with someone else, it can't be published, I can't perform it. That's too raw to welcome other people into until I have some time from it, some space from it, or until I've done an edit that makes it like a good enough container to share. With my students, there are whole parts of myself that I don't share, but there are some ways they get a lot more of me because I talk a lot about some like neurodiversity stuff that I don't usually talk about with colleagues, but I talk about it with my students because I know it's important to them and important to them to have role models, but I don't talk about it with my colleagues or my bosses or a lot of people. And I don't share it in big platforms because I don't know how it's going to be received. But then there are like, I don't tell my students about my trauma unless there is like a little piece that I have fully processed that is directly relevant to what we're doing. So for me, a lot of it's context. And then there are some things, there's one or two things that I keep just for me that are just like hobbies that I love that I don't tell other people about unless they're like extremely close to me, because those are my like little getaway places when everything else is too much.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That is really helpful, actually.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and we wanted to ask a little bit further about how you identify yourself. So maybe that sort of is a good tie-in. I have the question about how you mentioned you describe yourself as a folk artist. What does it mean to identify as a folk artist, right? And so how do you think about participating in expressions of people's heritage to tell a story? There was one thing that you mentioned, I don't know if this ties in, but like mythological theater is what you mentioned before, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not sure if that connects, but if I could hear a little bit about that, or that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So for me, so I do Appalachian folk arts, primarily dancing, but also like I do sing. I don't sing out and around, like I have circles of people where I sing. And I sing to myself, but like inheriting and carrying on those songs and those dances, like I do perform as a folk dancer with a group. And those are really important to me. Those like give me so much life. The mythological theaters, I work with a theater company called the Kabiri, that does what they call performative mythology. And like the kind of oomph behind that is taking the stories of endangered or extinct cultures and presenting them through movement arts like dance and aerial and circus arts and giant puppets, which are a beautiful folk tradition from Europe, and also storytelling aspects, and music and lights. It's a whole production. Yeah, and that feels very important to me. Those feel like, that feels like it's like a small piece of what I get to do, but it feels like one of the most important and like alive pieces to me. So those parts are very important. In terms of identity in general, I don't put a lot of stock in identity as like where I'm at. Like, I think it's like a necessary and massively important developmental stage, but I think ideally there's a point where you just kind of settle with it. And in most of the things that would be identity labels for me, I've pretty much settled in them. There are one or two that are new in the last year or two to my understanding. And so I'm still very much in like an identity formation and reconsideration of myself and my experience in the context of those. But eventually I will get to a point where it's like, no, this is just that kind of that integrating thing. It's like, I don't need to piece them out. They all like exist in this little spot together. I think I'd rather say in my bio, like I was asked by one of my 6th grade students once, do you make poems? And I was like, that is the best question I've ever heard. Like, I would rather, like, it's just, my bio says poet and folk artist because it's the shortest way to say it, but I'd rather have it be the verb versions. I'd rather have it be like making poems and performing and sharing folk art. Like, that's more interesting to me. The verbs are much more compelling than an identity noun. At where I'm at in my life right now.
Thank you for sharing that. Nicole, did you want to follow up with that, or should I have like?
You go ahead. Yeah.
So I have a burning question. I mean, this is something that arose for me like last night as well. I had a question about how you think about place. You know, I was reflecting on your poem, Diadremus, which is, for those of you that have encountered it, it's a description about salmon and their senses, and woven into that poem is also markings of memories and, again, the spatial sensitivities and notion about place. And so I'd love to hear you talk about what place means to you. And I think that might open up more questions for the audience and then from Nicole as well.
Sure. And I think a lot of this is like very indigenous. For me, like places they're living things, and like not just the individual trees, but like the place itself is a living entity and is something you have a relationship with. And I felt once I was taken from my mom and then living for my later childhood and all of my preteen and teen years in this like hostile anti-native environment, like kind of having no parents, it felt like my neighborhood and the neighborhoods I spent time in. So like I grew up in North Seattle, but I also spent a lot of time in Capitol Hill being a queer young poet. So those places felt like they raised me in place of humans a lot of the time. Like there were other like humans who stepped in and helped out with raising me, but it felt like the land parented me as much as or more than anything else at the time. And so like to me, those are like very, very tangible and very felt relationships. And it's also part of why it's very difficult. Like part of why I moved to Tacoma was economic pressure, just because I can't afford to live in Seattle anymore. But like another part of why was like, we had to move because of some nasty circumstances out of our control towards the beginning of the pandemic. But I wasn't as sad to leave Seattle as I thought I would be, because it didn't feel like my home in the way that it had. It felt like a stranger, partly because like I wasn't running into people on the streets. And that's part of what community and home means to me, is you don't need to schedule time with people to see them. you just see them because you live your lives on the same tracks or intersecting tracks. And also just like all the development in Seattle and like the cultural shifts have really felt like, I don't know you anymore. Where is the person I loved? Sometimes that still shines through, but like, yeah. So that relationship, like any relationship, can get complicated and emotional. And there are also,
Sorry. I have an audience question. They're asking, do you think that having a connection with the subject you're talking about makes your poem stronger?
I think I'm struggling a little with the premise of this question. I'm like, what is not having a connection with something you're writing about look like? Aisha, you can also type things in that aren't strictly questions if you want to respond to this, given that it's our chat mechanism. I mean, one thing I'll say, and I think this gets into a little bit of like psych stuff, is like, you know, you might not think you have a connection to things sometimes. Things just kind of leak out. Like I studied in college, like my field of study was comparative lit with like a focus in film studies, but like primarily comparative lit. And one of the like theory texts we looked at in my last year was James Berger, something of an end, theory of an end. I don't quite remember what it was, but he talks a lot about how like when like people who make art and people who create narrative are kind of showing a side of themselves they may not even have access to. Like sometimes stuff leaks out. Like I think most sci-fi that isn't consciously dealing with colonialism and climate change and imperialism, I think is subconsciously dealing with it, because those things leak out. They're still happening for you, even if you're not conscious of them. And so I think that can happen sometimes with your art. You might make something that you're like, why did I make this? And then 5 years later, you're like, shit, oh, that's why. I'm gonna sit with that now. Actually, I see Claire. So sometimes my teachers ask me to write about something and I totally don't feel like I can connect with it. I mean, I think my way then, I don't know, I always give my students an option to like screw the prompt and write whatever feels alive to them. But maybe your teachers don't let you do that. I think I'd be curious about like, where is something you can connect with, or where is something you can get just one hook into, even if it seems like a reach. Like
I've had that recently actually, and I find myself answering like the opposite question. Like they're like, what was exciting to you? And I was like, this is what was really not exciting. This is where I was having the trouble. Yeah, so I totally get that.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach, because like if you're not connecting, there's also like, there's probably some disconnect there, and that disconnect can be just as juicy as a connection. I would say get curious about it. I know I also said earlier I'm big on creative constraints. I'm like, how can that prompt or offering still give you something, even if it's not very good? Like sometimes you will get prompts that just aren't very good or don't work for you very well, but like, how can you still find some way to get something out of it for yourself? I think would be how I approach that. I've had prompts like that before that I've been given by teachers where I'm like, I just don't really connect with it, but here's my version, my interpretation. Does that help, Aisha?
I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if I should try to ask a few more audience questions. I did compile some that I had gathered prior to this. So then, well, first, I think I want to ask you what you're currently working on. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what's coming up? Like we know about Exhibit, but is there more coming that we should be looking out for? Where do we find your information? How do we stay informed about what you're working on?
Yeah, you can go to my website, ariannetrue.com. I have a mailing list, and I also publish when I get poems published. I put them on there, but the mailing list is where I like send out when a thing happens. You can also follow me on Instagram at Arianne True. The big thing is exhibits, finishing that by the end of the calendar year, and then starting to make the installation for April. That's like where a lot of my energy is going right now. other little poems keep peeking up through the cracks. And then once that's kind of squared away and I'm starting and the installation's over and I'm sending that out to publishers, the focus shifts to the second project, which I don't have a name for yet. I'm just calling it the boarding school project, which is like connecting my upbringing and what happened to me as a child and a teen to like the history of my family and my tribe and a lot of Native peoples in general in the US and Canada. And looking at the way those things just repeat themselves in new ways and they just get harder to recognize. And that's going to be structured as a fugue. So that's like a lot of inspiration from music in that piece that I think will probably be a book length project.
Yeah, can I ask you just a little bit more about your installation and like what does the installation maybe look like? You describe spaces, right? So can I probe you just a little bit more, and then yeah, we probably have to wrap it up soon. But
yeah, it'll be in the poncho form at the ref, which is like a big open room. We're going to build some temporary walls and things like that. And so there will be 2 gallery spaces. This is my plan for now. We'll have to see once the book is actually done. There's going to be 2 gallery spaces that have those gallery poems, like the ones I showed you. And then there's also going to be an area that I think will be very messy. The second section of the book is called Evidence. And it's like it's in the conceit of the book, it's like other materials from the artist and scholars on the exhibition. So like poems from the artist's notebook and like invoices and lesson plans and things like that that are kind of like these extras that give a lot more context to the gallery. I think that area will be messy. There's also going to be sound installations throughout. I'm stoked.
we're so excited for that. Yeah, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I just wanted to thank you again for all these invitations for us to, for me personally, just to feel what's just below the surface. I feel it in my body, like I said. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your beautiful questions. Thank you for like all the wonderful things you said and for like spending so much time with my work. That means so much to me. It was fun to hang out with y'all.
And yeah, thank you to everyone who tuned in. And if you have questions that come up for Arianne that you weren't able to ask, there is a contact section on the website. So yeah, do a little bit of that, and your question will be answered. But even if you don't have questions, definitely check out Arianne's website. It's awesome, and there's all kinds of great stuff on there. And yeah, just thank all of the 3 of you for the wonderful conversation. I really, Arianne, I think you called them glimmers. There was like glimmers that were coming out of this conversation for me as an artist that I was like, ooh, okay, I gotta hold on to that. So just thank you for being so open to share your work with us and to engage with our campus community. And thank you to those who were in the webinar and asked questions and made the conversation richer in that way as well. So just so appreciate all of you, and Arianne, especially for you to come in and share your amazing work with us. I can't wait to dive in and read more. Yeah, so we'll be continuing our series around the theme of return in January. So on January 24th at 1, we'll be joined by Shireen Lonnie Eunice, a writer, director, and co-host of the Ethnically Ambiguous podcast. And if you, like I just mentioned, if you want to check out some more links to Arianne's work, you can go to her website, or you can also go to the Artist as Storyteller website. Before too long, we'll have the recording of this conversation up, and also just some links to some other works. So I think this is the time to say goodbye. It's been so wonderful, and thank you all for being here, for the wonderful conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I wish I could have seen you all.